So, Lindsay, you finished Eagle's Guard, what, about 3 years ago now, if I got that right?
Yeah.
And here we are with the second book. So tell us a bit about Eagle's Path. Why did you choose the word path for this first
Yeah.
this second book?
Well, yeah, as you've nicely introduced, Eagle's Path is the second book of the Eagle Rider saga. And it pretty much picks off exactly where Eagle's Guard left off. So it follows the same characters of Aidan, Branwen, and Tristan. There's also two new perspective characters in this one. So I'm not going to name them at the moment because I'm going to be very careful and not give away spoilers throughout this evening. But basically, the story follows these characters in their fight against the Brathider, who are led by a dark wizard called Sorcier. So there's lots of adventure, lots of magic, lots of eagles, journeying, castles, battles, kind of standard epic fantasy things. As for the title itself, it was actually my brother Ian who came up with the title. I'm notoriously bad for not naming my own works. So Ian probably has credit for most of the books I have written and maybe will ever write. Who knows? But Eagle's Path, it just fits really well because a lot of the story is about the characters kind of finding out who they want to be, their strengths and weaknesses, what their kind of place is in the fight against darkness. And not to give too much away, there may or may not be an actual physical Eagle's Path as well, but you just have to read it and find out.
Brilliant. Sounds good. Lindsay, I have to say, when I look at the book that you've produced, I look at it and think I'm in awe really of, like, how do you actually go about writing a book like Eagle's Path? Like, I mean, how do you think of all the words? There's a lot of words there. So, I mean, how do you plan it all out beforehand? Before you even start?
Yeah, well, for this series, like the whole of the Eagle Rider saga is based on a draft of a book called Eagle Rider that I wrote way back when I was 17. And so a lot of the kind of main plot points of the story I know already, and I have known for quite a few years now. But I think since writing the first book, Eagle's Guard, the story has expanded so much that when I came to start writing Eagle's Path, I knew where it was going to start and I had a good idea of where it was going to end. I say good, I didn't quite have it all figured out. But like this time round, there was a lot of gaps and a lot of blank space in between. So it was only really Aidan's part of the story that I had fully formed. And even that wasn't like fully formed. So a lot of it was kind of figuring out how all these other characters got from the end of where I left them at the end of Eagle's Guard, all the way to where I knew I wanted them to be at the end of Eagle's Path. So there was a lot of it, I'd say I worked it out as I was writing. I'm not very good at outlining things in advance. So I kind of knew where I was starting. I knew the first few chapters where they were going to go. And then I just kind of started writing, and it's quite fun to do it that way actually, because you kind of you let the characters almost like show you where the story goes, and sometimes it goes in unexpected directions. But on the other hand, it can be a bit frustrating sometimes because I sometimes write myself into a corner and then I think, oh, this just isn't working, and then you have to scrap chapters and go back and do some quite major edits, which can be a bit disheartening and make it take a bit longer. But it just seems to be my style of working. So maybe for the next book I'm going to try and do a bit more outlining, see if it works better, but we'll see if I fall back onto my usual way of working.
So you clearly got quite a few different perspective characters. That's what you called them. So writing from different perspectives of the different characters. Do you find, I mean, do you find it quite easy to write from so many different perspectives? Is it quite straightforward, or is it quite tricky? Because I imagine, because then you have to kind of weave all those different stories together, the perspectives together.
Yeah. So, well, as I said, this book, there's 5 different perspective characters, whereas the
Yeah.
first book there's 3 perspective characters, but actually most of, like, over 50% of the book was just from one like point of view character. So this time round there was a lot more kind of the story spread between different characters. And I think, like, certainly that it's a good thing because it gave me more room to expand the story and the different events that you see. So you weren't, before I was limited only to events that Aidan, Branwen and Tristan had seen or were part of, whereas now I've expanded it to these 2 other characters. And so instead of them all kind of being in the same place, I can have like 5 different bits of story going on in different parts of the world at different times. So it was like huge scope to expand what I could talk about. It does make it a bit more tricky for writing. Is I write things in chronological order, but this time around I had to kind of do it in blocks almost. So I would write a block of chapters from Aidan's perspective, and it helps me just to keep the flow of his story going. And then I would come and write a block from maybe Branwen's perspective. And so these blocks might be happening simultaneously. And it was only probably the end of draft 2, I think, that I started splitting up the chapters into the order that you'll see them in the book just now. So it was a lot of, at the start, the first few drafts looked quite different just because of the ordering of the chapters. And then it was a bit of a task to try and think, right, so this chapter needs to come before this chapter, but then I need to make sure that I don't reveal this piece of information too soon. So there was a bit of a spreadsheet going for a while, trying to keep track of where everyone was at what time. But I think, the main difficulty as well of writing different perspective characters is you have to be really on the ball, is remembering whose head you're writing from. So if I'm writing a scene which maybe has Aidan and Branwen in it, I need to remember that if I'm in Aidan's head, I can't say anything that sounds like Branwen would say it, or that would sound like a thought that Branwen would have, kind of thing. So you got to think about which character you're writing from, and then think about how they would view what's going on, what emotion would they have in this scene. So it's what you call deep point of view, trying to make it so that you're completely in the character's head. So that's one of the things I've learned this year. I'm still getting better at it, I think.
Brilliant. What was one of your favourite things then about writing this book?
There's so many things.
Don't say finishing it.
It's just been done, yeah. There was, I think it's always kind of nice having one book kind of under my belt that I could almost like try out some new things or kind of expand on things I've learned before. And I think for me, like a lot of the best bit of this writing this book was that kind of freedom of not knowing how the characters get from the beginning to end, all those blank pages I had to fill, which blank pages can be scary as well, don't get me wrong. But I think the first book was based so closely on material I already had. It was quite nice to do new stuff in this book. So it was just so fun finding out the stories of the different characters, getting to expand the world of Tehran a lot more. And I think I probably did a lot more world building for this book. So the characters, I'd say, they get to meet a lot more of the wild magic creatures. They get to visit a lot more places that they haven't been to before. There's I kind of use a few kind of old legends that I've kind of made up as part of the history of the land, including one of my favorites, which you'll get to fairly early in the book. It's called The Tricking of the Trees, and it kind of explains how humans learn to use the runic magic that's like the kind of main magic throughout the book. And like speaking of magic as well, there's the whole bad guy magic as well, which is kind of new to this book. It was sort of hinted at in the first book, but it was really fun figuring out how that was going to work. And I think Ian and I had a lot of long conversations talking about twisted runes versus normal runes and how this works and how that works. And also just conversations about, so this kind of magical creature, what do they look like? How do they work? What sort of society do they have? And some of the magical creatures, like there's the Fae that are kind of based on like Scottish, like the Sheev kind of fairy folk type people. But I used a lot of like my archaeological background to kind of make up villages for them and things like that. So probably the world building was one of my favorite things
Cool.
about the book, essentially.
Cool, brilliant. Thank you very much. It's been great just to hear a bit about the process of writing a book, and certainly as somebody who doesn't, I love reading books, but I'm no book writer, no author. So it's fascinating to know how you go about doing that. I think this would be a good moment just to pause and ask you to read some of your book.
Yeah.
If that's all right.
Yes, it is all right.
It's not like you've prepared anything, I'm sure.
I have in mind a bit that I can read, and I'm looking at my time, and we're kind of a bit ahead of time, so I'm going to read the slightly longer version of the bit that I was going to read. And forgive me if I have to stop and take a bit of water every now and again, because so basically this scene, because I've said that the world building is like one of my favorite bits, I thought I'd read you a bit. Well, I'm trying to find a bit that's not got too many spoilers in it, which is quite difficult, but I thought I'd read you a bit when they have an encounter with some of these new wild magic creatures that appear in the book. So this bit picks up, basically Aidan and the Eagle Riders are trying to escape from the Brathadir at the start of the story, and to do so they have to go through Kelpie territory, and basically they don't really want to encounter the Brathadir, they don't really want to encounter the Kelpies either, so this is just what happens when they maybe do encounter the Kelpies. So okay. It was not long before the spectral edges of the lochs came into view through the mist. The waves lapped gently, moved by some unseen force, but there was no sign of the legendary water horses. Aidan's muscles tightened as they entered the spit of land between the lochs. The mist seemed thicker down here, and the faint light of Lewis hardly seemed to penetrate it. There was no sign of the eagles flying above. On either side was murky water, swirling with silt. Further out, it looked jet black, as if the bottom of the lochs dropped away to hidden depths. The narrow spit was no wider than 5 men abreast. The short, reedy grass that covered it offered no comfort. A sudden splash and snort came from their right, making Aidan jump. A creature, blacker than night, was rising from the water, murky rivulets dripping over its flesh. The mist swirled around it, giving it a ghostly air. Its head was horse-like, but the black fur was sleek and scaly, and feathery fins protruded from the tangled mane along the ridge of its neck. It turned towards them, red eyes glinting. Above his head, Aidan's rune flashed red in warning. Fear spiked through his chest as he sensed the creature's magic testing his own. He had not faced such a thing before, and he willed strength into the rune, hoping it would be enough. The Kelpie flicked the tendrils of its tail and turned away from them. "I don't think it will attack," said Sigurd, who was walking ahead. "But if more come, don't look at them." Aidan frowned, resisting the urge to glance behind. How was he supposed to not look? The thought of a Kelpie at his back made his spine tingle. He clenched his jaw and was glad when they all picked up their pace. It must have taken at least half an hour until the spit of land widened at the far side of the lochs. With a weary smile, Leif patted Arthur's shoulder. and pointed through the rolling mist to the ridge ahead. A slight breeze brushed Aidan's face, beckoning him to safety. His taut muscles began to slacken. They were nearly through. A gust of wind swept over the water, dissipating the mist around them, and giving Aidan a sudden clear view across the loch. His blood ran cold. In the shallows, barely a stone's throw away, were the dark, treacherous shapes of at least 20 kelpies. Some stood, tails flicking, while others nosed around in the water. Aidan poured his strength into Lewis. He knew he should not stare, but some strange compulsion held him. One of the herd raised its head and fixed its gaze on them. It stepped forward. Arthur quickened the pace once more, veering away from the dark shapes in the mist. Aidan wrested his gaze from the dark horse and followed. Lewis, the protector, flared red again, a deeper, darker red than before. Ahead of him, he saw the Eagle Rider's runes doing the same, some fading until they were close to nothing. With every step, Aidan felt drawn to turn back and stare at the sleek black body and glowing red eyes. The clop of hooves rang in his head. He focused on the protective light of Lewis and hoped that the riders were strong enough to endure. "Svanna!" hissed Sigurd. Aidan looked ahead and saw that Svanna had strayed out of line, veering back towards the kelpies. The light of Lewis, the protector, no longer danced above her head. Her face was strangely serene. Sigurd dashed after her, reaching for his wife. A loud splash came from the water, and one kelpie started moving towards her, breaking into a gallop. Sigurd drew his sword, Arthur and Myra rushing to help him. The water horse reared at the swords, hooves flailing. Sigurd's sword was knocked from his hand. He ducked and rolled, then was on his feet, running towards Svanna. She frowned. "Don't kill it," she whispered. Sigurd reached her and frantically drew Lewis, the protector. Svanna blinked, and her focus shifted to Sigurd. Her face turned pale at the sight of Arthur and Myra beating back the kelpie behind him. "Come on," said Sigurd. Arthur and Myra drew back. "Serenith," said Leif urgently. Aidan turned to see that Erin was no longer behind him. All the while they had been fighting the kelpie, she had been walking slowly towards the loch. The rune above her head was completely faded. Myra must have lost control of it while she fought. "She's enchanted," said Leif. Without thinking, Aidan broke into a run. Erin was at least 100 yards away, already close to the water. He had to reach her before she reached the kelpie. The creature pawed the ground, nostrils flickering, and the fins on its neck standing upright. It saw Aidan. Red eyes flashed, and it broke into a run. Oblivious, Erin kept walking to her death. Aidan ran faster, his chest and legs burning. But the kelpie was faster. It was going to get there first. Aidan threw Lewis, the protector, ahead of him, its light catching Erin in its glow. She stopped abruptly, bewildered. It was enough. Aidan crashed into her, knocking her to the ground, moments before the kelpie snapped at the air where her head had been. Aidan rolled to his feet, ducking as he saw wildly flailing hooves out the corner of his eye. Instinctively he cowered, sticking his arm out in protection. The hooves thudded onto the ground mere inches beside him, and a stench of hot, damp bog swept over him. A sickening feeling settled in his stomach as he felt his hand come in contact with something scaly, wet, and most certainly alive. Arthur ran up beside them, dragging Erin to her feet. Aidan tried to follow them, but something tugged on his arm. He forced his eyes to look, and saw that his hand rested on the kelpie's flank. He was stuck. The water horse snickered, and victory flashed in its red eyes. Aidan tugged at his hand, but it stayed flat against the kelpie's side. The kelpie stalked towards the loch, dragging him with it. Aidan struggled, digging his heels into the ground until the earth churned beneath him. He pulled at his arm, crying out in rage. He was stronger than the beast. He had to be. Again and again he struggled, until the awful truth set in. Sigurd's words floated through his mind. He had to cut off his hand or die. His left hand fingered the hilt of his sword. Suddenly there was a screech from above. Golden feathers and sharp talons descended through the mist, raking the air around the Kelpie's face. The water horse recoiled from the ferocity of the attack, rearing to the side and jerking Aidan so sharply he fell to the ground. He threw out his hands to catch himself. With a joyous jolt of energy, he jumped to his feet. Isler's attack had caused the Kelpie to release him. A few feet away, the beast snorted in anger, fixing Aidan in its red gaze once more. Aidan gulped. Behind it, the rest of the herd were emerging from the water. Aidan ran. In the back of his mind, he heard the Kelpie take up the chase, hooves hitting the ground far faster than he could run. A shadow fell across him from behind. This was it. The end. Aidan, came a desperate screech. He looked up. It was Isler, her talons outstretched. Aidan threw up his arms, reaching to grab Isler's feet even as her claws closed around his wrists. His feet slowly lifted from the ground. Aidan glanced back, seeing the Kelpie right behind. Isler was not high enough. The black creature reared, snapping at Aidan. He pulled his feet up underneath him, but the Kelpie's reach was greater than he thought. He cried out, feeling sharp fangs sink into his heel. Behind, burning black pain rushed through his body. Something hot was stealing up his leg, streaming through his blood. Dark creatures with red eyes danced across his vision. His mind turned to black. And if you want to find out what happens next, you have to read the book.
And that looked like it was quite close to the start as well.
Yep, that was chapter 9.
Yeah, fairly early on in the book.
So
lots to happen.
So yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lindsay. Brilliant to hear all of that. One of the things I liked a lot, and we saw glimpses of it in the trailer for the book. It was just like in Eagle's Guard, the first book. There's lots of illustrations throughout Eagle's Path as well.
Yeah.
They're all hand-drawn, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
By your brother Ian, another talented person in the Stirling household.
Yeah.
This is sort of a question still about kind of what happens, the process of writing, but what stage in the process are the drawings done? Does he produce them? What stage does Ian produce them?
So, as you said, there's 23 black and white illustrations in Eagle's Path, and as you've seen in the trailer, there's like color versions as well this time, which we didn't have for Eagle's Guard. So there's the 23 black and white illustrations, and we've also updated the map. So if you look closely, there'll be a few more new place names on it this time as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think most of the illustrations, I'd say, were done probably between draft 3 and draft 4. Ian can correct me if I'm wrong. And that's like draft 5 being the final draft, essentially.
So if there's still another draft to go, does that mean they can sometimes influence where the story goes?
Yeah. So basically, Ian kind of started doing them after most of the story wasn't finished, but it was close enough to not having major plot changes. Because for the first book, he had done a couple of illustrations, and then I cut the chapters, and then the illustration had to get cut as well. So he held off a bit longer this time, and then actually we were closer to being finished than I thought, and so that was maybe a bit of a rush at the end. I think we had high hopes to do more than 23, but it takes a long time to do these illustrations as well. So but yeah, so some of them, I'd say most of them, I don't really give Ian any sort of brief. He just kind of reads an early version of the book, and then he picks the kind of scenes, and he picks the chapters and the moments in the chapters that he thinks will work good visually to draw. So most of the time he just does it, and I'm like, yeah, that's great. But there is a few times when, for instance, something Ian has drawn will influence me, and so when I come back to do the edits, I'll change something, or occasionally as well, there'll be a scene that I'm like, this is exactly how I kind of picture this, so I want you to do it this way. I think the best way, I've got a couple of illustrations lined up to kind of show you on the screen, so I'm just going to give you a couple examples of different the different ways that the kind of illustrations and the story work together. So I thought it'd be good to start off with the illustration that goes with the scene I've just read. So Jeff, that's the one that's called Bad Horse. Yep. So as you can see, that here are the very kelpies that that our heroes have just been trying to escape from / fight with. So basically, this one, Ian did the drawing of it after he'd essentially read it was probably the second or third draft of that chapter. So the actual like plot line of the chapter didn't change too much. But when Ian came to me with the illustration, like things like the fin along the back of the neck and like the kind of clawed hoof type feet and the kind of like long tendrily tail and things like that. So it's just details like that I really liked from this image. And so when I went back to edit that chapter afterwards, like some of the descriptions that have come in, like I now mention that it's got this fin along the back in its mane kind of thing. And so I kind of if you'd read an earlier draft of that chapter, a lot of those details wouldn't have been in it. So so that really helped me kind of bring the descriptions of that chapter to life. So let's move on to the next illustration, which should be, this one. So this one is actually quite a special illustration because it was drawn before I even started writing the book, which is quite unusual. For most of the illustrations will be done after I've written quite a bit of the book. But this one is actually a character that Ian himself has created, or I should say two characters. So you've got the man on the ledge, and then there's an eagle up on the cliffside above him. So basically Ian had come up with these characters, and he'd envisioned this scene of when Aidan and Isla, who are the ones at the bottom of the image, when they first meet these other characters. And so this was, as I say, before I'd really started writing the book, and we managed to fit it so well. So Ian's characters actually are in the book, and they're like fully fledged characters throughout, and they will remain in the series. But basically this kind of visualization of the first meeting, I pretty much wrote that scene based off Ian's sketch. And that's kind of one where the artwork informs the book rather than the book informing the artwork. So that's another way around. Another way it can work. And then finally, if we look at the last image, this one's like almost the opposite end of the spectrum. I'd say this is probably the one where I gave Ian the most instruction as to what I wanted it to look like and how I wanted it to be. So this is the Fae I mentioned earlier. This is one of the interiors of one of their roundhouses which they live in. So being an archaeologist, I do a lot of things with roundhouses, digging them up, looking at pictures of them, reading about them, finding things that people used to have in roundhouses, all sorts. So I had quite a firm picture in my mind of this is going to be based off an Iron Age roundhouse that I have excavated somewhere. And so it wants to have X, Y, and Z in it. So you've got the big central fireplace kind of area, and then you've got the big kind of internal post ring of pillars, and then some nice walls around the edge. And then what I then said to Ian was that after showing him lots of pictures of reconstructed roundhouses and things, I was like, and the art style for this kind of culture is kind of based on Celtic art. So lots of like really intricate Celtic knots and all sorts. So I really asked a lot of him for this, I think. Because I think Celtic knotwork art is not the easiest to do. But anyway, he's done a really great job, and to me, it's come out pretty much exactly how I wanted it to look in the end. So yeah, that was one when I was quite specific about what I wanted to happen with the art.
It's phenomenal artwork.
Yeah.
The big well done to Ian, who I know is watching.
Yes.
Well done. It's just amazing. Yeah, give him a round of applause. There's a few people doing that.
Yeah.
Brilliant. And they really add another dimension to the books that,
Yeah.
it just really kind of cements the images of what you're reading in your imagination as well.
Yeah.
It's brilliant.
I'm definitely very lucky to have someone in the family who's willing to help out with these things.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Not many authors get that opportunity, I don't think. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Cool.
So moving on then, Lindsay.
Yep.
I know that you're very much self-published. You've had to do that. You've done that yourself, and that's quite a challenge in its own right. Not even just for getting the word out there.
Yeah, I mean, being self-published is definitely one of those things that it's got really big challenges, but it's also got really big rewards, and they kind of go hand in hand with each other. Like all of my books are self-published in partnership with Steve Hall at Cookies and Oxygen Publishing. And yeah, I think I really love being self-published just because it gives me that creative control over how I want my book to look, what content I want to have in my book. I don't have someone saying, like, looking at my book and be like, oh, don't think you need this chapter, we're going to cut it, or you've written too long a book, we're going to cut it shorter. So all of those things, I'm like, yeah, I can make the final decision on everything. I can make the final decisions on like the cover art, the content. And I've discovered that I really quite enjoy the whole editing side of the book, and also like typesetting it to get ready for print. So that's a whole new set of skills I've had to like teach myself over the last few years. But I think like self-publishing as well, it can be really hard, and it can be quite lonely sometimes, because like Steve and I, we're just kind of two people trying to figure it out as we go. We don't have a big team of like industry professionals behind us helping out. So basically everything that you see in the books is me and Steve working together, with the help of Ian with the artwork and things. And yeah, I think like this year especially, we had to have a lot of long discussions over how to get the book printed and how to get it distributed, because it's not a short book. And a lot of these things for self-publishing, it's all kind of print on demand based, in which case you kind of have to pay per page. So the more pages of book I have, the more expensive it is for me to get a book out there. And Eagle's Path is quite long. So yeah, I think like the industry in general is still very much set up in favor of traditional publishers, or self-published people who write short books, basically. We had a lot of conversations about figuring out how to what was the most viable way to get a book out there without making it cost a fortune for you guys to all buy it.
Yeah.
But when me and Steve can still get like £1 or £2 back per book, because that's really all I get back from what you spend to buy the book. I only see maybe like £1 of that at the end of the day, which when you think about it, it's like takes a lot of effort to do that. So that's like a big challenge. And then also I think probably for me the hardest thing is just the marketing and kind of advertising side of it as well, because it's quite hard to like promote yourself. Sometimes you have to be quite like brazen necked almost, just like put yourself out there, which I'm not great at. And you also
I guess that's
to...
Sorry, Lindsay. I was going to say, I guess that's where the importance of other people who read your books, leaving reviews, writing, whether it's on Amazon or Goodreads or wherever else that they can leave reviews to encourage other people to buy and read.
Yeah, I definitely, for someone who doesn't have like a big publisher behind them, it's a lot of it is just down to like having a fan base almost of people who enjoy the book and who are willing to share it with other people and tell other people about it. And for instance, as you're saying, like leaving reviews is the simplest thing to do ever, and it makes such a difference. Because I think on Amazon you don't get a rating shown until you have 50 reviews.
Okay.
So it's one of those things that I don't even have 50 reviews for the first book yet. But if everybody who joined this meeting, there's apparently like 36 participants, that's I'm more than halfway. If everyone here just left a rating and maybe like a one-line review, it just suddenly the book shows up on Amazon more readily. It's easier for people to find it. And then people also trust that it's a good book. I think a lot of it is that when you're self-published, it's harder for people to trust that you're actually like written a good book until people start talking about it. I guess that's whereas at least when you've got a publisher behind you, you're like, okay, a publisher said this is a good book, so therefore we can trust that kind of thing. But
Absolutely.
I think, yeah, definitely this year that's been one of my biggest kind of things I've had to grapple with, that whole how do I get more exposure for the book on social media, on Amazon, on Goodreads, just so that it's people that it's more than just people that I know who know about the books. So yeah, that's probably the biggest challenge for me at the moment anyway.
Cool.
But I don't think I would ever change being self-published, even though it's difficult. I'll get there eventually.
Okay, so message to all of us: get on to leaving reviews.
Yeah, if you
That'd
can.
be the biggest thing we could do, along with buying a book.
Yeah, I mean, you can buy a book as well, and then, I mean, it doesn't even have to be a long review, just like a simple 1 or 2 lines of what you thought about it. And it doesn't even have to be a 5-star review, just any reviews are welcome.
Great. We're coming to the end of my questions, Lindsey, but I've got one more for you. Okay.
Yep.
This is a tricky one.
Okay.
Here we go. Okay. If you could go on an adventure in the world of the Eagle Rider saga, okay, if you could go on an adventure in the world of the Eagle Rider saga,
Yeah.
which of the characters would you want to have as your traveling companion?
Oh, that's so difficult. I
Who
feel like
would you pick?
it's one of those. It's like asking like someone to pick their favorite child.
I know you created them all.
How do you pick? um, I think like, I mean, part of me says the obvious answer would be Aiden, just because I know him the best, and I think like he's adventurous, he's got a good sense of humor, he's pretty handy with magic, so like if anything attacked us, we'd be all right. But I think maybe he could be a bit reckless sometimes, which I think might make me a bit nervous to go traveling with him. So I don't know, maybe like there's a couple of side characters, they're called Rook and Signy, and they're in the Feather Guard, so they kind of live out in the forest a lot of the time. I think they'd probably be pretty good to go traveling with because they're pretty knowledgeable about the forest. They would know how to survive in the wilds. But I also think they're like quite laid back, and you'd have like a good laugh around the campfire at night as well, probably. So yeah, maybe they would be the ones I would actually go traveling with, and I'll just visit Aiden when I'm there.
Cool, brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Well, I think it's time to open up our discussion to any other questions that anybody wants to ask.
Yep.
So we are still recording, but you should find that you can now type questions into the chat function if you want to do that, or you can put your thumbs up, and I'm just going to put myself back onto gallery view so I can see everyone. If you've got a question and you want to put a thumbs up, then you can ask a question as you like. We'll open it up for...
Yep.
anyone to ask? And if not, I'll ask another question.
Mm-hmm.
While people are thinking, did you have a favourite scene to write, Lindsey?
Did I have a favourite scene? Oh, see, that's really difficult to answer without giving away any spoilers. Yeah, I think in Eagle's Path there is a very crucial scene that's probably about halfway through the book, and it's probably one of those scenes that's kind of survived from my very original draft, and I've kind of always known this point was going to happen, and it's very central to Aidan and Isler's storyline over the course of all of the books. So I don't know how much more I can say without giving it away, but when you read the book, you'll probably understand what I mean. That it's being a very crucial crucial point. I could probably tell you which chapter it's in, so when you get to it, yeah, it's at the end of chapter 37.
Chapter 37. Okay.
If you get to the end of chapter 37, then that's, you can be like, oh, so that was Lindsey's favorite scene to write.
Okay, we'll take note. There's one or two other questions here, Lindsey, for you.
Yeah.
Deborah's asking, who is your favorite new character?
Oh, my favorite new character. See, that's an interesting question for me, because instantly I have to think which ones are the new characters, because it's all kind of based on a story that I wrote originally. Some of the characters that seem new to all of you are not so new to me.
Yeah.
But I think my favorite new character is a character called Marcus, and I won't say too much about them, but they were very fun to write, and they're not a human character. And yeah, so that's maybe an interesting thing. They're not a human, and yeah, I think he's quite a witty character, so it was quite fun just to kind of get in his head and say some witty lines that maybe annoy some of the other characters.
Yeah.
And then he's the character that tells one of my favorite legends from the Tricking of the Trees legend. So yeah, he was probably my favorite new character. But
okay.
for me, again, he's been around for so long in my head, he doesn't really feel so new to me, but I'm looking forward to all of you getting to meet him.
Brilliant. Thank you. We've got some more questions. Gami says, did you learn anything from writing the first book that you could use when writing the second book?
Almost certainly. Trying to think of it on the spot right now. I think a lot of what I learned from the first book was sort of general like writing technique, like how to write almost. So how do I explain? I guess that whole kind of concept of the different character points of view, and just like a lot of the techniques that you can do to really make it seem like you're in the head of a character rather than having someone narrating a story to you. And I think as well, in general, a lot of the sort of technical side of writing came a lot easier this time. And that was because I'd gone through such a rigorous editing process for the first book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Miriam asks, this is one of your younger readers, what do you do when you're writing a story and you get stuck?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, Miriam, because it happens quite often. I find when I get stuck, when I've sort of maybe written myself into a corner or I can't figure out what's happening next, there's maybe a couple of options. I'd either go on to a different character and write a bit of story from someone else's point of view for a while, just so I can kind of keep writing, and sort of not lose the flow of being able to write. And then often you find when you think about these things subconsciously for days and days, you almost just come up with the solution without thinking about it. It seems a bit weird. But it's almost like your subconscious brain thinks through the problem while you're thinking about other things. So sometimes I do that. Other times, if it's just not working, it's usually a sign that I need to go back a few chapters and change something and kind of edit it so that the story goes in a different way. But usually, even when I'm stuck, I tell myself writing 10 words is better than writing no words. So even if I can write 10 words that are kind of rubbish, it's better than writing nothing at all. And eventually you try so many different ones of those 10 words, and you then eventually hit the right 10 words. And so it all makes sense and you can keep writing. So that's kind of what I do when I get stuck.
Thank you, Lindsay. Lots of questions coming in. Nicola is asking, do you find inspiration for your characters from people in your life?
Not directly. I don't ever like base a character specifically on someone I know, but I have been told that there are certain bits in the book that are quite like my dad. Especially when certain characters are not answering questions in a straightforward way. So apparently I'm told that's a bit like my dad, but it's not intentional, Dad. So yeah, it's not really specific. I try to avoid basing any characters specifically on anyone, but I might occasionally use a character trait from someone I know. Or it's even just using your experience of people and different ways they react to things. So yes, I definitely am influenced by people like real people, I guess.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily anyone based on anyone in particular.
Cool, thank you. And it's almost related to that. What about other authors? Have other authors which other authors have most influenced your own writing? Andrew's asking that question.
Yeah, so I mean, as a person writing epic fantasy, you kind of have to say Lord of the Rings. I think the general the setting and story of Lord of the Rings have probably inspired me a lot for my own kind of setting and the type of story. And I think also like another kind of typical one is the Narnia books. I'd say the Narnia books are some of my favorite books, and I think in particular, those ones have really kind of inspired and influenced me as well because of like C.S. Lewis, the way that he kind of put a lot of like Christian themes in the background of all the Narnia books. I'd say my books are not quite as good as his in getting like things like Christian themes in the back, but I do really like to take my like inspiration, like each book there's usually a Bible verse that's kind of inspired it, and I like to try and get aspects of just things that how do you even say it, just like aspects of who God is, or how you kind of live out life as a Christian, kind of just really subtly in the back of some scenes.
Yeah,
I think C.S. Lewis has definitely inspired me on that side of the writing. And then probably another big writer that influenced me would be Christopher Paolini, who wrote the Aragon series. So when his books first came out, I was about 15 or something, and I absolutely loved them. And he wrote his books when he was 15, and they were definitely the sort of the spark that set me off. Like, I can totally write a book myself as well. And I think, yeah, my books have probably got a lot of similarities to those ones as well.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
A couple more questions. Ailey's asking, are any of your characters particularly special to you? And if so, who and why?
Oh, that's really difficult. Yeah. Oh man, who did I pick again? I think maybe Branwen is probably like a character that I relate to a lot, and so like she's quite she's probably one of my favorites, apart from Aiden. And it's probably because like Brandon's probably like the closest character to like my own character, like in real life, so to speak. So there's a lot of things in Branwen's kind of story arc, I'd say, that I would relate to. Like she starts off being she's not really very confident in herself. She doesn't really like the whole fighting side of things. But in Eagle's Path, she definitely gets to take on a lot more, maybe not dangerous jobs, but she kind of like, she gets her courage together a bit more, I think. And yeah, I think I probably relate to her a lot more in that if I was in that world and having to face like real life battles and stuff, I would be terrified. And so I really like to think that I could be as brave as Branwen and kind of face up to those fears and be able to become a braver, more courageous person.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah.
We've got one last question, though if anyone's got any more, feel free to put them in just now. But from Kier, would you consider writing another spin-off story or writing other spin-off stories that are set in the same world but not in the main saga, or would you rather create a new world?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I have written a couple of short stories that are spin-off stories, and they are set in the Eagle Rider saga, and they're available as ebooks now if anyone wants to read them. But basically, those stories kind of happened because there's in some of the main kind of saga, characters reference events that have happened like maybe 10, 20 years ago, or things that have happened in the past that they kind of joke about, or there's reference made to them. So for some of those stories, I actually write the story of the event or the legend that's happened ages ago. And it's, for me, it kind of started off as just having this as a sort of reference for what they're talking about. But actually, I've quite enjoyed making them into little short stories. So I definitely have plans to write more short stories along those lines that are kind of related to the main saga. They'll feature characters from the saga, but they don't have to be, they're like standalone stories as well. And they're just like short, they're about the length of one chapter kind of thing. When it comes to, or would I rather create a new world, I think probably I will at some point want to create a new world, because I have other drafts of books that I've written that are in completely different worlds, and I think I'd really love to give those worlds a chance to be seen by all of you on the page as well. But who knows when I'll get round to that. But yeah, definitely, it's a bit of both there, Kier.
Brilliant, thank you. So we have one last question, which has just come in from Phil and Kirsten Joy, and it says, when can we expect the next one?
Oh,
I think
Phil.
the answer is give her a break.
Yes, Elaine.
Before you start getting on to the next one. And I want to know, have you got a title for it?
Yes. Well, let's put it this way. The next one, I don't know when you can expect it. That's the honest answer. But my plan is to start outlining and maybe planning things a bit more over my Christmas break. So maybe it will be with you sooner than the gap between Eagle's Guard and Eagle's Path. But it's always hard to say because I work full time as well, and you never know how much time you have to get on with the writing, and you never know how smoothly the plot's going to come together. So then how many books have been in the series? How many books will be in the series? That's 2 people have asked. I've just seen Jenny has just added up how many.
Yes.
Do I know how many books will be in the saga? At the moment, the plan is to do another book, so it'll be like a trilogy, the main 3. As for the title, potentially Eagle's Destiny.
Ooh.
But I think we'll have to wait and see if the title fits with what happens in the story. I mean, at the moment, with the ideas I've got, I think Eagle's Destiny will fit, but I'm not going to tie myself to that. even though it's now been recorded in the book launch. So the plan is to have that trilogy. At the moment, I don't have any specific plans for other books, either in the series or in the world, other than the short stories I've mentioned. But that does not mean that I won't in the future, because I think these characters are all quite special to me, and I'd probably love to continue their stories. But I suspect after writing the third book of the Eagle Rider saga, I may well write something else that is completely unrelated, just to try something different and see how it goes. Because so much of my life so far has been spent in the Eagle Rider saga, and it would be nice to either revisit one of my other projects or just to come up with something completely new. Because most of the projects I've come up with is I'm still working through all the material I came up with as a teenager, so it would be interesting to see, like 10 years on from that, what sort of stories I would want to write next.
And that seems like a very good place to
Yeah.
say thank you very much, Lindsey. It's been such a pleasure to listen to how you go about writing these books and to just hear a bit more about them. And I will confess, I have a copy of your book, but I have not yet read it, and I will do. I'm excited to do that. I've read the first one, and it's not a genre that I would normally read, but I particularly enjoyed it. So I'm looking forward to the next one, and I'm sure I can speak on behalf of everyone else watching to say well done. Congratulations on finishing a second book and getting it out there, and we will do our very best to spread the word and encourage others. And yeah, I guess we've got people, if people want to buy books as Christmas presents, there's still an opportunity to do that.
Yeah, so if anyone wants to buy a book, you can go to my website, which is lindseystirling.uk, and there is opportunities to buy Eagle's Guard or Eagle's Path there. And if anyone gets confused, there are two sizes of each book. So you can get one this sort of size, which is pretty standard UK paperback size, but then there's also these shiny new ones, which are slightly taller, but they're slightly thinner as well. So if you buy off Amazon, you get the one this kind of size. So you can buy either of those books off my website. And if you can, please buy straight from my website, because it's the best way to support me and Steve in our little publishing venture. But yeah, so there's copies on the website, and you can share the news with all your friends. They can get them there too.
Brilliant.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of finish by saying thank you to everybody for coming to the book launch, and it's been so good to see all of you, and it was always really difficult this year knowing how a book launch online would work. So it means a lot to me that you've all come to listen and ask questions, and basically, yeah, just thank you so much for coming. We'll probably end the recording pretty soon, but I'm gonna stick around as well. So if you want to chat more or ask any more questions off of the record, so to speak, then feel free to hang around and chat for a bit if you'd like to. So on that note, goodbye everyone. We shall end the recording.